My wife testified that 7-year-old Poppy was being abused by her father, with photos of bruises and the child's own testimony. But the custody evaluator, Dr. Brennan, dismissed everything as normal childhood play and gave the father full custody, so he beat Poppy to death during his first weekend. And when I confronted Brennan about it, he laughed and said, "Sometimes these situations resolve themselves." So I recorded him admitting he'd dismissed abuse allegations in 12 other cases while living in a beach house paid for by grateful parents, until my wife exposed his 30-year pattern of taking bribes to give custody to abusers. My wife, a child therapist of 14 years, came home completely silent and walked straight to her home office. I heard ripping sounds, and when I went to check on her, I found her shredding every certificate on her wall. She was destroying her degrees, her licenses, even the thank you cards from kids she'd helped. She just kept feeding paper into the shredder while tears rolled down her face. It took me almost an hour of sitting beside her before she finally looked at me. 2 weeks ago, she had testified in the Kent custody case. 7-year-old Poppy had shown all the signs: bruises in different stages of healing, flinching when adults moved too quickly, drawings of herself with black eyes and her daddy with big red hands. My wife had documented everything meticulously. She'd spent 6 sessions with Poppy, building trust carefully. Poppy finally told her about the bad nights when daddy drinks, but there was more. Poppy had whispered about the special game daddy played. She'd shown my wife on the dolls exactly what happened. My wife had immediately reported it to Child Protective Services. They said they'd investigate. They never did. Dr. Richard Brennan, the custody evaluator, had already filed his report. Dr. Brennan had dismissed every piece of evidence. He claimed the bruises were from normal childhood play. He said the drawings were coached by the mother. He even suggested my wife was inexperienced with high-conflict divorces. He wrote that Poppy's mother had alienation syndrome and was turning the child against her father. The judge listened to Dr. Brennan, the expert with 30 years of experience. Full custody went to the father. The mother got supervised visits twice a month. Poppy's mother had collapsed in court. She'd screamed that they were signing her daughter's death warrant. Security dragged her out while she begged anyone to listen. My wife had tried to comfort her outside. The mother had grabbed my wife's hands and said, "You know what he is. You're the only one who believed her." My wife promised she'd keep fighting. She'd file appeals, contact supervisors, do anything to protect Poppy. My wife had begged Dr. Brennan to reconsider. She showed him photos, session notes, even a recording of Poppy crying about going to Daddy's house. Dr. Brennan's response was cold. "Some therapists see abuse everywhere. That's why we need experienced evaluators to see through the noise." He'd smiled at her like she was a naive student. "You'll understand when you have more experience." Yesterday at 3 p.m., my wife got the call. Poppy Kent was dead. Her father had struck her to death during his first weekend with full custody. The police found her little body covered in new bruises layered over the old ones. The same pattern my wife had documented. The same injuries Dr. Brennan had called normal. Poppy had been clutching the teddy bear from my wife's office, the one she'd given Poppy to help her feel safe. The news report said Poppy had tried to call 911. Her little fingers had managed 3 numbers before her father stopped her. The neighbors heard screaming but assumed it was just parenting. After all, the courts had given him custody. He must be a good father, right? The worst part came this morning. My wife went to the courthouse to find out how this could happen. She overheard 2 lawyers talking in the hallway. Dr. Brennan had just been promoted to lead the state's new custody evaluation program. They were laughing about how he always knows which parent will win. One of them mentioned that Brennan's beach house was awfully nice for a court employee's salary. The other replied that Brennan had helped his client last year, and gratitude comes in many forms. My wife ran to the bathroom and threw up. Then she came home and started shredding everything. She kept saying, "I became a therapist to protect children, but I couldn't protect Poppy. The system wouldn't let me protect Poppy." She showed me her phone. 17 missed calls from Poppy's mother. She couldn't face answering them. She passed out on the office floor around midnight, exhausted from crying. I spent the rest of the night planning. My brother is a private investigator. I've seen enough to know how these things work. Men like Dr. Brennan don't just make mistakes. They make choices. And someone had to find out why he made the choice that called Poppy Kent. I met Dr. Brennan at his favorite coffee shop at 7 a.m. I knew his routine from my brother's research. He was there in his expensive suit, ordering his usual lavish breakfast. I sat down at his table uninvited. He looked annoyed until I mentioned my wife's name. Then he looked wary. I told him about my wife shredding her degrees, about Poppy clutching that teddy bear, about the 3 numbers she'd managed to dial. His face didn't change. "Your wife needs to understand that custody work is complex. Not every therapist can handle it." He actually looked bored, like we were discussing a parking ticket instead of a dead child. I leaned forward and asked him directly, "How much did Poppy pay you?" He laughed. Actually laughed. "You're talking nonsense. I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what's best for children." I asked him if Poppy Kent would agree. His response made my blood run cold. That child was troubled. She would have had problems regardless. Sometimes these situations resolve themselves. Resolve themselves. That's how he described a 7-year-old being murdered. I asked him to repeat that. He did, adding, "The mother was clearly coaching her. Children that age don't know what's real." I stood up and pulled out my phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation," I said. His smug expression finally cracked. The color drained from his face completely. For the first time since I'd met him, Dr. Richard Brennan looked genuinely afraid. His hand trembled as he reached for his coffee cup, then thought better of it. I kept the phone visible, making sure he could see the recording app still running. The breakfast crowd around us continued their morning routines, oblivious to what was happening at our corner table. A mother with 2 young children sat down nearby, and I watched Brennan's eyes flick toward them nervously. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. His fingers drummed against the table as he calculated his next move. I could practically see the gears turning in his head, weighing options, considering angles. This was a man used to controlling narratives, to being the expert whose word carried weight in courtrooms. "You're making a mistake," he finally managed, his voice lower now. "Recording someone without consent is illegal in this state." I shrugged. "So is taking bribes to destroy children's lives." His jaw tightened. He glanced around the coffee shop, checking if anyone was listening. The barista called out someone's order, and he flinched at the sound. When he looked back at me, there was something different in his eyes. Not fear anymore. Calculation. "What do you want?" The words came out measured, careful. "I want you to think about Poppy Kent every single day for the rest of your life." He started to speak, but I stood up. My brother had taught me the value of leaving while you held the advantage. Brennan grabbed my wrist as I passed his chair. His grip was stronger than I expected from a man his age. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he hissed. I've been doing this for 30 years. I know judges, lawyers, people who can make your life very difficult. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back at his face, and I know a 7-year-old girl is dead because of you. He released my wrist. As I walked away, I heard him make a phone call. His voice was urgent, worried. Good. Back home, I found my wife awake, sitting in the kitchen staring at her phone. The missed calls from Poppy's mother had increased to 23. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red and swollen. Where were you? I poured myself coffee, thinking about how to explain. My wife had always been the idealist between us, believing in systems and procedures and proper channels. I'd learned long ago that sometimes the proper channels were the problem. I went to see Dr. Brennan. She straightened in her chair. What did you do? Just talked and recorded. I played her the conversation. As Brennan's words filled our kitchen, sometimes these situations resolve themselves. She covered her mouth with both hands. When it finished, she was shaking. He knew, she whispered. He knew what would happen, and he didn't care. My phone buzzed. A text from my brother. Your friend Brennan just called 3 lawyers in the last hour. Want me to keep digging? I showed my wife the message. She nodded slowly, something hardening in her expression. The woman who'd spent 14 years believing she could save children through therapy reports and court testimony was gone. In her place sat someone who understood that the system she'd trusted had culled Poppy Kent. What's your brother found so far? I pulled up the preliminary report he'd sent last night. Brennan's been the custody evaluator on 43 cases in the past 5 years. In 38 of them, custody went to the parent who could afford better lawyers. In 12 of those cases, there were documented abuse allegations that he dismissed. She took my phone, scrolling through the data. 12 kids, she said quietly. 12 Poppies. We don't know that. Yes, we do. She looked up at me. I know the signs. I've spent my entire career learning to recognize them, and he dismissed them 12 times. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. You need to delete that recording. Brennan's voice was different now, controlled but with an edge of desperation. I'm willing to discuss this reasonably. Are you? Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour. Well, doctor. Brennan went from, I know what's best for children, to, please delete that recording, faster than you can say, career-ending confession. Nothing quite like watching someone realize their expensive breakfast just got a whole lot more expensive. Alone. We can work something out. The line went dead. My wife was watching me intently. He wants to meet, I told her. It's a trap, or a trick. He's probably planning to, I know. I was already texting my brother, but he's scared. Scared people make mistakes. She stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, normal people were living normal lives, taking kids to school, going to work, not knowing that men like Brennan decided which children lived or died based on who could pay them more. I want to come with you, she said. He destroyed my career, my faith in everything I worked for. I have a right to face him. I thought about arguing, then saw the look in her eyes. This wasn't my idealistic wife talking. This was someone who'd watched a system she trusted murder a child she'd tried to save. Okay, but we do this smart. My brother arrived 30 minutes later with equipment, a second recording device, smaller and more discreet, a camera that looked like a button. He'd already been to Riverside Park, scouting locations. He'll probably want to meet by the pond, my brother said, spreading out photos on our kitchen table. Isolated but public enough that you'll feel safe. Here's what you need to know. As he talked through scenarios and contingencies, I watched my wife. She was absorbing everything with the same intensity she'd once applied to child development theories, but there was something else in her expression now. Purpose. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Mr. Brennan asked me to call, a woman's voice said. He's reconsidered the meeting. He'll be at his office instead. 1 hour. The line went dead before I could respond. My brother frowned. He's trying to control the environment. His office means his territory. So we don't go, my wife said. No, I said, thinking. We go, but not how he expects. 45 minutes later, we sat in my car outside Brennan's building. It was a professional complex, all glass and steel and respectability. The kind of place where decisions that destroyed lives were made in comfortable conference rooms. My wife wore one of her old court outfits, professional but understated. The recording devices were in place. My brother was positioned across the street with a clear view of the building entrance. Remember, I said, we're just there to talk. Let him think he's in control. She nodded, checking her reflection in the mirror. For a moment, I saw the therapist she'd been, composed, professional, ready to advocate for children who couldn't speak for themselves. Then I saw the steel underneath, the anger she'd been too shocked to feel yesterday, the determination that came from knowing a little girl had died clutching the teddy bear she'd given her for comfort. We walked into the building together. The security guard barely glanced at us. Just another couple here for a meeting. Normal people doing normal things. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. My wife's hand found mine, squeezing once before letting go. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, we stepped out into a hallway that smelled like expensive carpet and air conditioning. Brennan's office was at the end. The door was already open. He sat behind his desk like a king holding court. The walls were covered with degrees and certifications, proof of his expertise. Photos showed him shaking hands with judges, speaking at conferences, being the respected professional everyone trusted. I sat alone, he said, looking at my wife. She has more right to be here than anyone, I replied. He studied us for a moment, then gestured to chairs across from his desk. We sat. The leather was soft, expensive. Everything in this room spoke of success and authority. Let's be clear, Brennan began. That recording you made is worthless, inadmissible in court. No prosecutor would touch it. I'm not interested in prosecutors, I said. His eyes narrowed. Then what? Money? Is that what this is about? My wife made a sound of disgust. Brennan's attention shifted to her. Dr. Chen, he said, using her professional name like a weapon. I understand you're upset. Losing a patient is never easy, but you have to understand, these custody evaluations are complex. There are factors you don't see from your limited perspective. Limited perspective? Her voice was dangerously quiet. You've been practicing, what, 14 years? I have 30 years of experience. I've seen hundreds of cases. Sometimes what looks like abuse is simply complicated family dynamics. Complicated, she repeated. Is that what you call bruises in the shape of adult handprints? Children bruise easily. They play rough, without proper context. I gave you context. Photos, documentation, session notes. He waved dismissively. Mothers coach children all the time in custody disputes. They plant ideas, create narratives. An experienced evaluator learns to see through that. I watched my wife's hands clench in her lap. Brennan didn't notice. He was too busy being the expert expert, the authority figure explaining reality to naive idealists. But Poppy's dead now, she said. How does that fit your narrative? For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, annoyance. Like Poppy's death was an inconvenient complication to his ordered world. Tragic, he said, but not predictable. Sometimes parents snap under stress. The custody process itself can be triggering. Stop. My wife stood up. Just stop. She's dead because you ignored evidence of abuse. Because someone paid you to look the other way. Brennan's face flushed. How dare you? I've built a reputation over 3 decades. I don't need to justify myself to someone who couldn't handle the realities of custody work. Realities like your beach house? I asked. Like the grateful clients who show their appreciation in creative ways? The flush deepened. Get out, both of you, before I call security. Call them, I said, pulling out my phone. I'm sure they'd be interested in hearing our conversation from this morning. The part where you said Poppy's death resolved itself. He stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. For a moment, I thought he might come around the desk at us. My wife stepped forward, putting herself between us. You killed her, she said quietly. Maybe you didn't put your hands on her, but you called her just the same, and we're going to prove it. Brennan laughed. It was an ugly sound. Prove it? You think you're the first people to question my evaluations? I have lawyers, connections, people who trust my judgment. You have what? A recording of a conversation taken out of context? We have 12 cases where you dismissed abuse allegations, I said. 12 children you put in danger. His smile was cold. Allegations. Unproven allegations. That's what you idealists never understand. Anyone can make an accusation. My job is to find the truth. Your job is to protect children, my wife shot back. My job is to make recommendations based on evidence and experience. If you don't like the system, take it up with the legislature. He moved toward his office door, clearly intending to end the meeting. But my wife wasn't done. What about Timothy Morrison? She asked. Brennan stopped. What about him? 7 years old. Broken arm. You called it a playground accident. It was investigated. He's in foster care now. His father broke his other arm 6 months after you gave him custody. Brennan's jaw tightened. You can't blame me for Sarah Chen, 9 years old. Cigarette burns. You said they were bug bites. The medical examiner was inconclusive. She ran away 3 times before someone finally listened. My wife pulled out her phone, scrolling through notes. Marcus Williams, 8 years old. Black eyes. You called it childhood clumsiness. He's been in the hospital twice since your evaluation. Stop, Brennan said. But she kept going. Name after name. Child after child. Each one a case where Brennan had dismissed abuse allegations. Each one a child who'd suffered because of his evaluations. Stop. He slammed his hand on the desk. You think I don't know their names? You think I don't remember every case? Then why? My wife's voice broke. Why did you ignore the evidence? He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older. You wouldn't understand. Try me. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, tired. Do you know how many custody evaluations I do a year? How many parents claim abuse? If I recommended against custody every time someone made an allegation, no child would ever see their father again. But the evidence can be manufactured. Photos can be staged. Children can be coached. After 30 years, you learn to read between the lines. Read between the lines, I repeated. Is that what you call taking bribes? His head snapped up. I've never taken a bribe in my life. Then explain the beach house, the generous clients. I'm good at what I do. People recommend me. Yes, I've been fortunate in my investments, but that has nothing to do with my evaluations. He was a good liar, practiced, smooth, but I'd seen him this morning, laughing about Poppy's death. This wasn't about complex evaluations or reading between lines. This was about a man who'd sold his integrity so many times, he'd forgotten he ever had any. My phone buzzed, a text from my brother. 2 men just entered the building, moving fast. Get out. I showed my wife the message. She nodded slightly but didn't move. We should go, I said. In a moment, she was staring at Brennan. I need you to know something. Poppy trusted me. She told me things she'd never told anyone else. She drew me pictures of what her daddy did. She showed me on dolls. Coached behavior. She was 7 years old. My wife's control finally snapped. 7. She didn't know the words for what was happening to her. She just knew it hurt. She knew it was wrong. How does someone train themselves to not believe children who are hurting? The way Brennan keeps saying coached and manufactured. It's like he built this whole system in his mind to explain away every single piece of evidence that crosses his desk, and she trusted me to help her. The office door opened. 2 men in suits entered. Lawyers, from the look of them. Brennan's cavalry. This meeting is over, one of them said. Dr. Brennan, we advised against this. Brennan straightened, his confidence returning with backup. Dr. Chen and her husband were just leaving. We stood. The lawyers flanked us, clearly ready to escort us out. But my wife had one more thing to say. Poppy called me the night before she died, she said. Did you know that? She called my office, left a voicemail. Brennan went very still. She said she was scared, said daddy was angry about the court thing, said she wished she could come live with me instead. My wife's voice was steady now. I couldn't call her back. It was after hours. I thought I'd talk to her mother in the morning, figure out a safety plan. Dr. Chen, one of the lawyers said, you need to leave. She ended the message by saying she loved me. A 7-year-old girl who'd known me for 6 sessions. She said she loved me because I listened, because I believed her. Tears were running down my wife's face, but her voice never wavered. You culled her, Dr. Brennan, and we both know it. The lawyers escorted us out through the hallway, their hands hovering near our elbows without quite touching. My wife walked with her head high, but I could see her shoulders trembling. In the elevator, one of the lawyers pressed the lobby button and stood blocking the control panel. Neither spoke. They were professionals, hired to handle problems quietly. My brother met us at the building entrance, falling into step beside us as we walked to the car. He gave a subtle shake of his head, telling me the 2 men he'd warned about weren't a threat, just Brennan's legal protection arriving on schedule. We drove in silence for several blocks before he finally spoke. He explained that Brennan had made 17 phone calls in the past 2 hours, 3 to lawyers, 4 to judges, and the rest to numbers registered to parents from his custody cases. The pattern was clear. Brennan was mobilizing his network, calling in favors, building walls around himself. At home, my wife went straight to her office and began pulling files from her cabinet, not shredding this time, but organizing. She spread papers across her desk, creating a timeline of every interaction she'd had with Brennan over the years, every custody case where their paths had crossed, every time she'd raised concerns that he'd dismissed. I watched her work with the same methodical precision she'd once used to document abuse. She was building something, though I wasn't sure what yet. My brother sat at our kitchen table, laptop open, digging deeper into Brennan's financial records. The beach house had been purchased 5 years ago, paid in cash. The seller was a shell company registered in Delaware. My phone rang. Unknown number again. This time I put it on speaker. Brennan's voice filled our kitchen, but the arrogance was gone. He sounded tired, maybe even afraid. He offered to meet again, just the two of us, no lawyers. He had a proposition, something that would benefit everyone. He suggested a restaurant downtown, public and neutral. My wife looked up from her files and nodded. She wanted me to go. My brother started to object, but she cut him off with a gesture. She explained that Brennan was rattled. The recording had shaken him more than he'd let on in his office. Now he was trying to regain control, but desperate people make revealing mistakes. I agreed to meet him in 2 hours. After hanging up, my brother immediately began researching the restaurant, checking exits, sight lines, potential recording challenges. My wife returned to her files, but now she was photocopying specific pages, creating a duplicate set. She handed them to my brother with instructions to keep them safe. The restaurant Brennan had chosen was expensive, the kind of place where deals were made over $100 steaks. I arrived early and chose a table where I could see the entrance. Brennan walked in exactly on time, but he looked different. The expensive suit was the same, but something in his posture had changed. He sat down heavily, like a man carrying invisible weight. He started by trying to appeal to my pragmatism. The recording I had was problematic for him, yes, but ultimately worthless in any legal sense. What could I really do with it? Post it online? Send it to news stations? He had lawyers who specialized in defamation, slander, cyber harassment. He could make my life very difficult. But then his tone shifted. He leaned forward, speaking more quietly. He talked about the reality of custody work, how most accusations were false, born from bitter divorces and parental alienation. He'd saved hundreds of children from being weaponized by vindictive parents. Yes, sometimes he made judgment calls that seemed harsh, but that was the nature of the work. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos. Children at graduations, weddings, family celebrations. These were kids from cases where he'd made controversial custody recommendations. They'd grown up happy, successful, loved. He kept in touch with many of them. They thanked him for seeing through the lies and giving them a chance at normal lives. I listened without responding, letting him talk. He was trying to justify himself, not to me, but to himself. The longer he spoke, the more cracks appeared in his narrative. He mentioned specific cases, dropping details he probably shouldn't have shared. Names, dates, circumstances that revealed more than he intended. Then, he made his offer. He would retire, step down from his position, recommend someone else for the promotion. He'd been thinking about it anyway, he claimed. 30 years was enough. He could spend more time at his beach house, travel, enjoy his remaining years. All I had to do was delete the recording and convince my wife to let this go. I asked about the 12 cases my wife had identified, the children who'd suffered after he dismissed abuse allegations. His face hardened. Those were complex situations, he insisted. I didn't have all the facts. Some of those children had behavioral problems that predated any custody issues. Others had parents who manufactured evidence after losing custody. The system wasn't perfect, but it was better than the alternative. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside were photos of my wife and me, walking into our house, shopping at the grocery store, getting coffee, all taken in the last 24 hours. He wasn't threatening us, he assured me. He just wanted me to understand that privacy was an illusion. If I tried to use that recording, tried to damage his reputation, he had resources too. I stood up to leave. He grabbed my wrist again, just like he had that morning, but this time his grip was desperate rather than threatening. He asked me to think about my wife. She was already fragile, broken by what happened to Poppy. Did I really want to put her through a prolonged battle? Lawyers, depositions, character assassination? He'd seen it destroy stronger people than her. I pulled free and walked out, leaving him sitting alone at the table. Outside, I called my brother immediately. He told me to check my car for tracking devices before driving home. He was right. I found a small magnetic box attached to the undercarriage. I left it there, but drove to a parking garage downtown instead of home, then took a taxi the rest of the way. My wife was waiting in the living room with my brother. They'd made progress. My brother had found connections between Brennan's beach house purchase and 3 custody cases from that same year. In each case, the parent who received favorable custody recommendations had sold property shortly after the decision. The amounts roughly matched what would have been needed for Brennan's down payment. But more interesting was what my wife had discovered in her files. 5 years ago, she'd written a letter to the State Custody Evaluation Board raising concerns about Brennan's patterns. She'd never sent it. Back then, she still believed in working within the system, addressing concerns through proper channels. Now she retrieved that letter from her drafts folder and updated it with current information. We spent the next 3 hours crafting a strategy, not a legal one, but something more personal. Brennan had built his life on reputation and relationships. Those were his vulnerabilities. My brother would continue investigating the financial connections. My wife would reach out to other therapists who'd worked cases with Brennan, and I would handle Brennan directly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those photos Brennan had shown me. The happy children at graduations. Were they real, or just another manipulation? How many poppies were hidden behind those success stories? How many children had suffered while Brennan collected his rewards and built his reputation? My wife found me in the kitchen at 3 a.m. She couldn't sleep either. She told me about a dream where Poppy was in her office again, playing with the dollhouse, safe and alive. But when she tried to touch her, Poppy dissolved like smoke. She'd been having the same dream every night since the funeral. She showed me something she'd been working on, a letter to Poppy's mother. Not an apology or explanation, but a promise. She would make sure Poppy's death meant something, that other children would be protected. She asked me to help her fulfill that promise. The next morning brought new complications. My brother called early with bad news. Brennan had filed a police report about harassment and threats. He'd claimed I'd confronted him at his office and restaurant, making threatening statements about his safety. He'd provided security footage showing our meetings, but no audio. It was a preemptive strike, establishing a paper trail in case we escalated. Then my wife discovered something worse. Those lawyers swooped in faster than relatives at a will reading. He's got backup plans for his backup plans, which would be impressive if it wasn't so morally bankrupt. 3 therapists she'd planned to contact had received calls from Brennan's lawyers. They'd been warned about potential defamation liability if they participated in any campaign against Dr. Brennan. 2 of them had already backed away, frightened by the legal threats. The third was wavering. Brennan called again that afternoon. This time his voice had regained some confidence. He'd clearly felt better after setting his legal machinery in motion. He offered to drop the police report if I agreed to his original terms, delete the the recording, stop the investigation, move on with our lives. He gave me 48 hours to decide. My wife overheard the conversation. Instead of being intimidated, she seemed energized. She recognized this pattern. It was exactly how abusers operated. Threats followed by reconciliation offers, creating fear, then offering relief. Brennan was showing his true nature, the same controlling behavior he'd protected in the parents he'd favored. She proposed a different approach. Instead of fighting Brennan directly, we should focus on the system that enabled him. The custody evaluation process that gave one person so much power over children's lives. The lack of oversight that allowed evaluators to dismiss evidence without consequence. The financial incentives that corrupted the process. My brother agreed, but pointed out the challenge. Systems were harder to fight than individuals. They had inertia, bureaucracy, protective mechanisms. But my wife had an idea. She still had contacts at the university where she'd trained. Professors who studied child welfare systems. Researchers who collected data on custody outcomes. Academic scrutiny might succeed where legal challenges failed. We spent the rest of the day refining our approach. My brother would continue tracking the financial patterns, building a database of cases where Brennan's recommendations coincided with property sales or large transfers. My wife would compile her clinical observations, creating an academic case study that avoided legal liability by focusing on systemic issues rather than individual accusations. And I would keep Brennan focused on me. Let him think I was the threat while the real work happened quietly in the background. It was a role I was willing to play. Every moment he spent worrying about me was a moment he wasn't covering other tracks or silencing other voices. That evening, I did something risky. I drove past Brennan's house, making sure to be visible. I parked across the street for exactly 5 minutes, then left. It was a psychological move my brother had suggested. Let Brennan feel watched. Let him experience a fraction of the powerlessness those children had felt. Within an hour, Brennan called again. He was furious, but also unnerved. He threatened to call the police, to file restraining orders, to destroy my reputation. I let him rant, then calmly reminded him about the recording, about his words dismissing Poppy's death, about how those words would sound to other parents, other evaluators, other judges. The call ended with Brennan breathing heavily, searching for words. Finally, he asked what I really wanted, not retirement or money or apologies. What would make this stop? I told him the truth. I wanted him to feel the weight of every child he'd failed, to understand that his choices had consequences, to know that Poppy Kent's death was his responsibility. He hung up without responding. My brother, who'd been monitoring Brennan's communications, reported a flurry of activity. More calls to lawyers, to judges, to financial advisors. Brennan was circling the wagons, preparing for war, but he was also making mistakes, leaving digital footprints that revealed more connections. My wife worked through the night, transforming her personal pain into academic precision. She created charts showing patterns in Brennan's evaluations, maps of outcomes correlated with socioeconomic factors, timelines that revealed how his recommendations had shifted over the years, becoming more favorable to wealthy parents as his own wealth grew. By morning, she had a preliminary report that was devastating in its clinical objectivity. No accusations, no emotional appeals, just data that painted a clear picture. She sent it to 3 professors she trusted, framing it as research for a potential journal article on systemic bias in custody evaluations. The response was immediate and encouraging. One professor called within hours, intrigued by the patterns. Another offered to connect her with a researcher who'd been collecting similar data from other states. The third suggested presenting the findings at an upcoming conference on child welfare policy. Brennan must have sensed the shift in momentum. His next call came that afternoon, and his tone had changed again. Now he was proposing a meeting with his lawyers present, a formal discussion about resolving our misunderstanding. He suggested his office, but I countered with a neutral location, a conference room at a downtown hotel. My brother advised against going, but I saw an opportunity. Brennan was reactive now, playing defense instead of offense. Every move he made revealed more about his vulnerabilities. I agreed to the meeting, but insisted on bringing my own representation. Not a lawyer, but my wife. She deserved to face him again, this time on more equal ground. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. That night, my wife and I prepared carefully. We reviewed everything we'd learned, every pattern we'd identified, every connection my brother had uncovered. We weren't going to negotiate or compromise. We were going to show Brennan that his empire was built on sand. My brother gave us one final piece of information before we left. He'd found a connection between Brennan and a judge who'd consistently assigned him to high-profile custody cases. The judge's son had received a scholarship to a prestigious private school the same year Brennan joined the school's board of trustees. It was circumstantial, but suggestive. Walking into that conference room, I felt the weight of what we were carrying. Not just our own pain over Poppy's death, but the silent suffering of 12 other children whose voices had been dismissed. My wife held her folder of data like armor, her professional mask firmly in place. Brennan was already there with 2 lawyers. He looked older than he had just days before, the stress showing in deep lines around his eyes. When he saw my wife, something flickered across his face. Regret? Fear? Or just annoyance that his problem had multiplied? The lawyers started with legal boilerplate about defamation, harassment, and privacy violations. They presented a cease and desist order, demanding we stop our campaign against Dr. Brennan. They offered a financial settlement in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement. The amount was substantial, more than my annual salary. My wife spoke for the first time since entering the room. She placed her folder on the table and began pulling out papers, charts, graphs, data. She explained each one in the same calm, professional voice she'd once used in court testimony. The patterns were undeniable, the implications clear. Brennan's lawyers tried to interrupt, but she continued methodically. She showed how Brennan's evaluation patterns had changed over time, how his recommendations increasingly favored wealthier parents, how the children from those cases had higher rates of emergency room visits, school behavioral problems, and subsequent child protective services involvement. Then she produced the letter she'd written 5 years ago but never sent, the one documenting her early concerns about Brennan's practices. She'd had it notarized yesterday, establishing its date of creation. It proved she'd identified these patterns long before Poppy's death, that this wasn't about revenge, but about a systemic problem she'd tried to address. Brennan finally spoke, his voice strained. He challenged her methodology, questioned her data sources, dismissed her conclusions as as the biased interpretation of a grieving therapist, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew how this would look to academic reviewers, to policymakers, to anyone examining the custody evaluation system. His lawyers proposed a different settlement. Brennan would take a sabbatical, citing health concerns. He'd undergo additional training in trauma-informed evaluation practices. In exchange, we would keep our research within academic channels, not release it publicly or to media outlets. They were trying to contain the damage. My wife looked at me, and I saw the same determination that had carried her through 14 years of fighting for children. She turned back to Brennan and asked him a simple question. Would he acknowledge that his evaluation of Poppy Kent had been flawed? Would he accept responsibility for missing the signs of abuse? The room went silent. Brennan's lawyers started to object, but he raised his hand to stop them. For a long moment, he stared at my wife. Then he shook his head. He maintained that his evaluation had been thorough and professional. The outcome was tragic, but not predictable. He would not accept blame for a father's criminal actions. My wife nodded as if she'd expected this answer. She gathered her papers carefully, returning them to the folder. Then she stood up, ready to leave. But before going, she placed a single photo on the table. Poppy Kent, smiling in my wife's office, holding the teddy bear that would be found in her arms when she died. Brennan looked away. His lawyers quickly covered the photo with other papers, but the damage was done. We left them there, huddled in conference, trying to strategize against an enemy they didn't fully understand. They were prepared for legal battles, not moral reckonings. Outside, my wife broke down. The composed professional facade crumbled, and she sobbed against my shoulder. She'd hoped somehow that confronting Brennan would bring closure. Brennan's lawyers are throwing around legal threats like confetti at a wedding nobody wants to attend. Meanwhile, my wife just turned their fancy conference room into her personal TED Talk with charts and graphs that basically spell out "you messed up" in academic speak. Instead, his refusal to accept responsibility had reopened the wound. Poppy was still dead, and the man who'd enabled her death still believed he'd done nothing wrong. My brother met us at home with news. The academic community was responding to my wife's preliminary research with intense interest. 2 more researchers had reached out, sharing similar concerns about custody evaluators in their regions. A journal editor had expressed interest in a special issue focused on systemic bias in custody decisions. But there was concerning news too. Brennan's lawyers had sent cease and desist letters to the university, claiming my wife was conducting unauthorized research using confidential case information. They were trying to shut down the academic avenue, just as they'd threatened the therapists. The battle was escalating. That night, I made a decision. I called a journalist my brother knew, someone who specialized in investigative reporting on family court systems. I didn't give her the recording or make accusations. I simply suggested she look into patterns in custody evaluations in our state. Sometimes the best way to fight power was to shine light on it. My wife spent the evening on the phone with Poppy's mother. It was the first time they'd spoken since the funeral. The conversation was painful, filled with shared grief and rage at a system that had failed them both. But there was something else too, a determination to ensure Poppy's story wasn't buried with her. Poppy's mother revealed something we hadn't known. She'd kept a journal throughout the custody battle, documenting every interaction, every concern, every moment when she'd felt the system working against her. She'd recorded conversations with her lawyer, who'd warned her that Brennan rarely ruled against fathers with financial resources. She had evidence we'd never imagined. The journal changed everything. Poppy's mother had documented conversations where her lawyer explicitly warned her about Brennan's bias toward wealthy fathers. She'd recorded phone calls where Brennan dismissed her concerns before even reviewing evidence. Most damning, she had a recording of Brennan telling her lawyer that mothers who made abuse allegations were hysterical and manipulative by nature. My brother worked through the night digitizing everything. By morning, we had a comprehensive timeline showing Brennan's pattern of dismissing mothers' concerns before conducting any real evaluation. The evidence was overwhelming, but we still faced the same problem. Legal channels were closed to us. Media attention would bring lawyers and lawsuits we couldn't afford. Then my wife had an idea that shifted our entire approach. She remembered that Brennan served on several professional boards, including the state's Child Welfare Advisory Committee. These positions required peer support and regular evaluations. If we couldn't reach him through courts or media, perhaps we could reach him through his colleagues. We spent the next 3 days preparing packages for key members of these boards. Not accusations or demands, just data. My wife's research presented as academic findings. Financial patterns my brother had uncovered formatted as statistical anomalies. Poppy's mother's journal excerpts showing concerning evaluation practices. Each package was carefully crafted to raise questions without making direct accusations. Brennan must have sensed something shifting. He called repeatedly, alternating between threats and offers. One moment he was promising to destroy our reputations. The next, he was offering larger settlements. His voice grew more strained with each call. The controlled professional facade was cracking. On the 4th day, things accelerated. A board member from the Child Welfare Committee called my wife. Dr. Victoria Lawson had reviewed the materials and found them deeply concerning. She wanted to meet privately to discuss the implications. My wife agreed, and I insisted on accompanying her. Dr. Lawson's office was modest compared to Brennan's opulent space. She listened as my wife presented her findings, occasionally asking pointed questions. When my wife finished, Dr. Lawson sat quietly for a long moment before revealing that she'd had her own concerns about Brennan for years. Other board members had noticed patterns, but lacked concrete evidence. She explained that the board was already planning Brennan's annual review. With this new information, they could conduct a more thorough examination of his practices. It wasn't a criminal investigation, but it could result in professional consequences, loss of board positions, peer censure, damage to the reputation he'd spent 30 years building. That evening, Brennan showed up at our house. I watched through the window as he sat in his car for 20 minutes before finally approaching our door. When I opened it, I barely recognized him. The confident evaluator was gone. In his place stood a man who looked hollow, desperate. He pushed past me into our living room, his movements erratic. My wife emerged from her office, and Brennan turned to her with something wild in his eyes. He started talking rapidly about misunderstandings, about context, about the complexity of his work. His words tumbled over each other as he tried to explain 30 years of decisions in a few frantic minutes. My wife listened without responding. When he finally ran out of words, she asked him one question. Did he remember Poppy Kent? Not the case, not the evaluation, but the child. Did he remember her face, her voice, her fear? Brennan's composure shattered completely. He sank onto our couch, head in his hands. For the first time since this began, he looked like what he was, an aging man who'd lost his way, who'd traded children's safety for beach houses and professional accolades. He mumbled something about pressure, about expectations, about how the system demanded certain outcomes. I told him about the board review, about how his colleagues would be examining his cases. His head snapped up, panic flooding his features. He begged us to reconsider, to understand that his entire life would unravel. His practice, his reputation, his marriage, everything built on his professional standing. My wife's response was measured. She told him about her shredded certificates, about the career she'd destroyed because she couldn't save one child. She described the weight of Poppy's death, the crushing guilt of failing to protect her. Then she asked Brennan how many children carried that same weight because of his evaluations. He left without another word, stumbling to his car like a man in shock. We watched him drive away, knowing we'd crossed a point of no return. The next few days would determine everything. The board review began the following week. We weren't part of the formal process, but Dr. Lawson kept us informed. Other evaluators were examining Brennan's cases, interviewing families, reviewing outcomes. The patterns my wife had identified were confirmed and expanded. More children emerged from the statistics, more families broken by biased evaluations. Brennan tried to mount a defense. His lawyers sent threatening letters. His allies made phone calls, but the evidence was too substantial, the patterns too clear. One by one, his supporters distanced themselves. Board positions were quietly withdrawn, speaking engagements canceled. The empire he'd built began crumbling. My brother monitored the situation from a distance. He reported that Brennan had listed his beach house for sale. His practice was hemorrhaging clients. The judge who'd consistently assigned him cases had suddenly stopped. The financial incentives that had corrupted the system were drying up. 3 weeks after the board review began, Brennan called one final time. His voice was different, smaller somehow. He asked to meet at a small cafe near his office. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I found him sitting in a corner booth, staring at untouched coffee. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. When he saw me, he didn't speak immediately. We sat in silence until he finally found words. He told me about his resignation from all board positions, about closing his practice, about his wife discovering the truth behind their beach house and leaving him. He'd lost everything that mattered to him, everything that defined him. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a letter. It was addressed to my wife. He asked me to deliver it, then stood to leave. Before going, he paused and spoke about Poppy Kent. He remembered her now, he said. Remembered her fear, her small voice, her desperate hope that someone would protect her. He'd carry that memory forever. I took the letter home unopened. My wife read it in private, then shared its contents. Brennan had written a detailed admission of his failures. Not legal confession, but moral acknowledgement. He recognized the harm he'd caused, the children he'd failed to protect. He couldn't undo the damage, but he wanted her to know that Poppy's death had finally opened his eyes. My wife spent a long time with that letter. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly she felt empty. Brennan's acknowledgement couldn't bring Poppy back. It couldn't heal the other children he'd placed in danger. It was just words from a broken man who'd realized too late what he'd become. The academic paper my wife had started became something larger. With Dr. Lawson's support, she expanded it into a comprehensive study of bias in custody evaluations. Other researchers contributed data. Therapists shared experiences. What began as personal pain transformed into professional purpose. 6 months later, the paper was published in a major child welfare journal. It didn't name Brennan directly, but anyone familiar with the system could read between the lines. The research sparked discussions at conferences, in boardrooms, among professionals who'd never questioned the evaluation process. My wife never returned to direct practice. The trauma of losing Poppy had cut too deep. Instead, she found a different path. She began training new therapists, teaching them to recognize bias, to fight for children within the system, to document everything meticulously. She couldn't save Poppy, but she could prepare others to save future Poppies. Brennan disappeared from professional circles entirely. My brother heard rumors that he'd moved out of state, possibly staying with distant relatives. His beach house sold at a loss. His name was quietly removed from professional directories. The man who'd once held children's fates in his hands had become a cautionary tale whispered at conferences. Poppy's mother found her own form of closure. She used her journal to help other parents navigating custody battles. She created a support group for mothers whose concerns had been dismissed. She channeled her grief into action, ensuring other children wouldn't suffer Poppy's fate. 1 year after Poppy's death, my wife received a package. Inside was the teddy bear she'd given Poppy, carefully cleaned and preserved. Poppy's mother had included a note explaining that she wanted my wife to have it, not as a reminder of failure, but as a symbol of someone who'd believed a child when no one else would. My wife placed the bear on a shelf in her new office at the university. Students sometimes asked about it, and she would tell them about a brave little girl who'd trusted her with the truth. She'd explain how systems could fail children, how bias could blind professionals, how one person's choices could destroy lives. The custody evaluation system didn't change overnight. Brennan was just one evaluator in one state, but ripples spread from our actions. Other researchers began examining patterns. Other boards started reviewing their evaluators more carefully. Parents became more aware of potential bias. Small changes, incremental improvements, nothing dramatic enough to make headlines. My brother eventually moved on to other cases, but he'd check in periodically. He'd forward articles about custody reform, about new oversight measures, about evaluators being held accountable. Progress was slow, often frustrating, but it was movement in the right direction. My wife and I found our own rhythm in this new reality. The trauma of Poppy's death had changed us both, but we'd survived it together. We learned to carry grief without letting it consume us. We found purpose in small victories, in every child protected, in every biased evaluation challenged. Sometimes I thought about Brennan, wondered if he ever found peace with what he'd done, but mostly I thought about Poppy, about the little girl who'd been brave enough to speak her truth to someone she trusted, about how her death had exposed a system that failed its most vulnerable, about how her story, though ending in tragedy, had sparked changes that might protect other children. The recording I'd made of Brennan that morning in the coffee shop stayed locked away, never needed for legal battles that never came. Its power had been in its existence. distance, in the fear it created, in the pressure it applied. Sometimes the threat of exposure was more effective than exposure itself. My wife continued her work at the university, training a new generation of therapists to see what others might miss, to fight for children even when systems worked against them. She never forgot Poppy, never stopped carrying the weight of that loss, but she'd found a way to transform grief into purpose. Thanks for reading this story with me. I hope you have a wonderful day.